American. I will end the war in Ukraine. I will stop the chaos in the Middle East, and I will prevent World War III from happening. We will rebuild our cities, including our capital in Washington, D.C., making them safe, clean, and beautiful again. We will teach our children to love our country, honor our history, and to always respect our great American flag. We will get critical race theory and transgender insanity the hell out of our schools, and we will keep men out of women's sports. I will defend religious liberty, I will restore free speech, and I will defend the right to keep and bear arms.
I'm talking with David Hogg, who's no stranger to this audience. He's a leader in the fight to end gun violence, the co-founder of March for Our Lives, and he now runs Leaders We Deserve, which is dedicated to electing young progressives across the country. It's good to see you again, David. I'm laughing because we just had coffee together in New York City yesterday, where I was covering that horrific fascist rally at Madison Square Garden. And just today, Donald Trump is back at it. The clip we rolled at the top of the show is of Trump in Georgia spewing the same kind of vitriol. I want to talk about what he's doing in the final days of this campaign. But David, I'd also love to get your reaction to that sidebar, which is pushing these indoctrination books on young people. The far right clearly hasn't given up the fight for their hearts and minds, have they?
Unfortunately not, Ken. They definitely have not. I think a major reason behind that, it's not so much strategic as it is financial. It's just one more way that they can sell more books to their cult, sell more $100,000 watches to their cult, their shoes, their Bibles. Can we just take a minute to step back to think about how Fox News would react if roles were reversed? If Vice President Kamala Harris was out there weeks before the election, slinging, Bibles for sale and shoes, crypto, and, makeup, cryptocurrency, whatever it is, how they would react. It's so ridiculous. And I just don't understand how anybody at this point, no matter how conservative they are, can't see this for the obvious grift that it is when the Republican nominee is literally posting over and over again about cryptocurrency just weeks before the election and buying his shit coins, basically.
Yeah, you're right. If the roles were reversed, if Vice President Harris was doing anything like that, she would be raked over the coals. Fox News wouldn't stop talking about it. Meanwhile, you have a Trump daughter-in-law literally running the Republican Party, turning it into a laundering machine, a cash machine for her family, and it's just gross. But my sense, leaving Madison Square Garden yesterday, was that this is not a campaign, certainly not a candidate going into the home stretch with a lot of confidence. It felt like a rallying cry for the most extreme elements of that base to take the fight to the streets if and when they lose the election on November 5th. Would love to get your take on that, because you were just at University of Pennsylvania. There are a lot of young people, young men in particular, who are voting for Trump.
Yeah, it's very concerning. To me, it seems like what Trump's trying to do is lay the groundwork for how, no matter the outcome, specifically if he loses, obviously, how he can say that the election was stolen from him once again. And it's extremely concerning. We're seeing him violate these democratic norms once again, and it deeply, deeply worries me. I mean, the fact that all of the people that have worked for him formerly have come out against him, including his own chief of staff, who, correct me if I'm wrong, Ken, he was a general in the military, right? That just came out and said that he was a fascist.
Yep. I mean, General Kelly, not only a 4-star general, here's a man who lost his own son, a fellow Marine in Iraq, gave more to this country than most people can fathom, and is an arch conservative. I mean, this guy was the architect of the family separation strategy, right? I have no love for John Kelly when it comes to the policies he implemented, but he for all those faults, he's a patriot. He thought he was doing what his country needed him to do, and he has given more to this country than most people, and he was Donald Trump's longest serving chief of staff, and says he's a fascist.
I mean, for God's sake, if that doesn't tell you everything you need to know, aside, along with the fact that Mike Pence is not running with Donald Trump again as a ultra conservative person, I don't know what other signs you need to see. I was just reminded yesterday when I was thinking back to some of the things that were going on in 2020 and what Trump was saying and how he wanted to use the military to shoot protesters demanding racial justice, and said, why can't you just deploy, the military to go out and shoot them in the leg or something? He is talking about the active deployment of U.S. soldiers against our own people. It is extremely concerning. And I know the polls say that it's close. I cannot believe that. I really don't believe that it's going to be that close, because I know that there are so many people, especially women, that are very, very upset, that are turning out and voting this election. Many of them that are voting Democratic for the first time because of the overturning of Roe versus Wade. And I don't think that we're accurately polling them. And I say that too from my own anecdotal experience knocking doors in Pennsylvania last weekend, where on a lot of doors you go and knock them, and the husband comes to the door and says, why are you knocking doors for Kamala Harris? We're Trump supporters. And we know from the data that the wife is not a Trump supporter. And I have to believe that people like that are not answering their phones when they're getting polled or taking a poll. And in 22 as well, we underpolled Democratic turnout, and we thought that it was going to be a massive red wave, but it ended up being much less than that. So I have to believe that and hope that something similar will happen this election cycle.
I think you're right. I think something similar, or even on a greater scale, will happen this cycle. We just had Alyssa Slotkin from Michigan on, who talks about this women's vote this year. And I mean, I can picture it as well. Picking up the phone, even if you decide to answer a polling call with your Trumper husband in the next room. And that conversation is going to be very different than the one you have with yourself in the voting booth when you're confronted with what Donald Trump has meant for women, and when you have to make a vote for your daughter or your granddaughter. I think that is going to be expressed on election day. But you have some real insight into how young men are feeling right now and why they are drawn to Trumpism. And you shared with me yesterday morning that it's not necessarily about policy. If anything, they're more aligned with Democrats, but there's something else going on.
Yeah, I think for a long time, there has been a taboo within the Democratic Party, understandably, to be talking about what we're doing for men, because it's too often when somebody says something like that, it's to the exclusion or oppression of women, obviously. But I think what has happened over the past few years is there's been a growing mental health crisis with men. They've seen their earning potential over the past several decades go down. So there's a disconnect between culturally where men expect themselves to be and where they actually are economically and societally, as a result of many broader societal factors like our transition to a service-based economy from a super industrialized one. But I think more than anything, what has caused the recent divergence between Democrats and Republicans is, one, obviously there's still sexism, to state the obvious, even if it's not direct, where some men just are not going to vote for a woman, and they may think that it's not because she's a woman, it's because of X, Y, or Z other factors that ultimately, end up being, thinly veiled misogyny, essentially. But I think the broader factor that we talked about yesterday is that within the Democratic Party, in part as a result of the growth of the education gap between Democrats and Republicans, I think that there's a strong sense amongst people, especially men, who we know are getting educated less than women now. Before the passage of Title IX, for example, men got bachelor's degrees at a rate 15% higher than women. And now women are getting bachelor's degrees at a rate 15% higher than men. I think that there's been a growing gap between the two groups, especially within our own vernacular, that causes a certain sense of judgment that a lot of men have, where they, even if they do agree with things like racial equality, gender equality, ending gun violence, taxing the rich more, and fighting climate change, they would rather be part of a group like Donald Trump, who they don't fully agree with, but at least they know is not going to judge them simply, or feel like they have to walk on eggshells around constantly.
It's Ken Harbaugh. Need to take a quick break here because I wanted to let you know that I have finally decided to take the plunge and figure out social media. The Ken Harbaugh Show is now up on TikTok and Instagram and Reels and Threads. I've got a great team pulling all this content together. Please check out the links in the show notes and follow the Ken Harbaugh Show pretty much everywhere. Thanks, as always, for the amazing support. None of this would be happening without you.
And I think a lot of this is the product of social progressive activism done, in my opinion, the wrong way, where it's very elitist, for one, and it's also very condescending, I think is the word that I would use to describe it, where people really feel like they're assumed to be stupid or assumed to have the wrong intentions, even though that they just may not have the privilege of having the education that a lot of Democrats have had at this point. But I think the important thing is too, Ken, that young men, if they've lost that much faith where they're now going conservative, I do not think that they are actually going to vote. And the reason why I say that is because they've become conservative just as essentially kind of a middle finger to the system, I think, to say, screw you, it's not working for me, so I'm just not going to support this person anymore. But when they've lost that much faith in the system, I think it's much more likely than not that they're just not going to turn out and vote for somebody like Donald Trump. They just won't vote at all.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. And that certainly hits home. We've both got Trump voters in our family, so I can relate to what you're talking about. If and when Kamala Harris wins, and we're going to have to work for it. This is not in any way a foregone conclusion. We have to run through the tape. But when that happens, there's going to be massive social rifts in our society, and I don't know how to begin the healing process. But you shared something with me yesterday morning about how slow you have to go. It's like, I think your phrase was melting an iceberg. Can you talk about your approach to engaging the Trump voters in your orbit or even in your family, and how you bring them back?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Ken, it's certainly not for everybody. I think that it's especially incumbent on people like you and I that, are some of the least affected in some ways by Trump's misogyny and racism in general. It's incumbent on us to be on the front lines of fighting that. And not on the people that are directly affected by that to have to go and talk to Trump supporters constantly. I just say this because it's my own experience and how I've decided to approach it. And I'm not saying that anybody else has to do it this way. But for me, the way that I've thought about it is I used to think back in the day after Parkland that I had to fully convince somebody of everything that I believed in, or else it was a total failure and worthless. And what I've learned in the time since talking to so many people who don't agree with me is that I don't need to fully convince somebody. A lot of the time, I just need to humanize myself or humanize, the values that we have as liberals to the other side. And what that looks like is there's so much of an assumption that automatically that we're going to judge them, that we're going to hate them, that we're going to call them names and other things like that, even though it might very well be justified. For me, what I decided is it's not so much about what feels good or what I say being totally right, and making myself feel good in that way. It's about what will actually be productive in getting progress made on this, where I don't need to convince somebody else of, everything that I believe in. I just need them to stop. If I can get them to stop hating me or hating our ideas slightly less, that's still progress. Because a lot of the time these people have such an assumption, conservatives have such an assumption that liberals just automatically hate them so much, and judge them, that if you approach them in a even half respectful way, the way that I've interacted with a lot of people who say terrible things to me on Twitter, where somebody will come to me and say, they'll call me some kind of expletive, and I say to them, look, I can respect that you don't agree with me, but I can't accept the fact that I know that you don't want school shootings or gun violence to continue either. Almost certainly you don't, I would hope. And act like there's nothing that we can agree on to make progress on this. And what I say to them is there anything that I could say to you that could remotely possibly change your mind? And when they say no, typically, I say, all right, well, I'm not going to bother trying to debate you on this then, because you've clearly made up your mind and nothing's going to change it. So why would I waste my time? Instead, why don't we focus on what we can agree on, which is the fact that, for example, 2/3 of gun deaths are suicides, and we need, you probably agree that we need more mental health funding for those to fight those gun deaths. And they say, yes, of course. And after every single one of those conversations that I've had, even if the person started out horribly with me, every single conversation that I've had like that, privately, online, and in person, they end up apologizing to me if they continue talking to me after they realize they're not going to get a rise out of me. And even though I've not fully convinced that person, I open the door to them to have the possibility of being able to change their mind. Because the way that our politics operates psychologically is we have in-groups and out-groups, right? You and I, Ken, we're in each other's in-group, and we see each other as part of being in that in-group. And the other side has their own version of that with each other, and they need to demonize us constantly so that they're able to justify why they have to be such assholes to other people over and over and over and over and over again. And when they actually interact for once with the out-group that has been demonized so much, and that out-group treats them with any basic level of respect at all, it's like pulling the string out of a sweater. It just all slowly starts to come undone because it shatters their worldview, because they're assuming that there is going to be such a vitriolic amount of hatred and judgment and us being so condescending to them that there is no way we would ever allow them to be part of our in-group, or they could even potentially see themselves as being in our in-group when we talk to them in that really basic way and say, look, I think I don't agree with you, obviously, and for all these different reasons, but I'm not going to say that you're an awful person. Obviously that can be hard, and there's limits to this, right? I'm not saying that we should go out and talk to, somebody who's truly an awful person that has extremely hateful beliefs, but we don't need to convince those people. What we need to convince are the 60% of people that are, kind of looking to be told how to think about the world and see themselves not so much as liberal or conservative, but have found themselves more on the conservative side because they've just been told by Fox News and these other right-wing media machines over and over and over and over and over again how to think about the world, and saying that other side, they hate you, they demonize you, they disrespect you, they don't care about you. And when we show that we even have any basic amount of respect or care for them as a human being, even though we may very much disagree with them, it starts to open the possibility of changing their mind.
Yeah. Well, as usual, David, I learn something from you every time we talk. Thank you so much for coming on. One thing before I let you go, can you share with the Midas Mighty audience here your interaction with that steam fitter who recognized you from this channel?
Yes. So I was out knocking doors in Pennsylvania this weekend, and there was a guy that I knocked on the door of who was part of Steam Fitters local union 420 in Philly, who I knocked on the door of, and he immediately recognized me from being on Midas Touch. I'm not making that up. Just is super excited to be voting for Kamala, getting his entire family out to vote. His son's a veteran as well. He's, understands the importance of this election, and he recognized me from actually being on here. And you guys have an incredibly powerful network and great viewers, obviously. And just thank you for having me on, Ken. And as one last thing too that I wanted to say, Ken, like the people that you talked to yesterday at MSG at Madison Square Garden, those are not the people that I'm saying that we are ever going to convince, or that we even need to convince, because they're so entrenched in their own ways, and they also have their own profit-driven motives of staying in that mindset constantly. We are not going to change their minds, and that is okay. What we need to focus on are the people that don't have a financial incentive of not changing their mind over and over and over again are family members and other people that we interact with on a daily basis, and having the strength to be able to have those conversations with them and the emotional control not to just lose it on them, even though it might be very justified, because it's not so much about what feels good or what even is essentially super, you being morally righteous, which is obviously significant and important. It's more about how do we actually make progress on this? And the way that we're going to do that is giving the opportunity for people to realize that they can change their ways and be accepted.
100%. Thanksgiving is right after the election. That'll be a test for every single one of us. Thank you, as always, David.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ian.